So now let's talk about how Ruby supports class inheritance and what is duck typing. So class inheritance is an object-oriented concept that every class implicitly inherits from object, and that's true in Ruby as well. Also in Ruby, object itself, the class object itself, inherits from another class called basic object. Ruby does not support multiple inheritance, so class always inherits from another exactly one class. Now, if you need the behavior of multiple classes, there's something called mixins, which we'll talk about later. So the idea is that the child class inherits parent's behavior, and child class can also override parent's behavior. So let's see an example of that. We have a class called dog, and it has a toString method, to_s method, which is dog, and then it has a method called bark, so dog barks. Now we have a small dog class which inherits, that's what this symbol means, it inherits from a class dog, and it can override the behavior of bark. So it's a small dog, so it barks quietly. So you instantiate dog, and you could also instantiate small dog, and then when you print them out, you have dog who barks regular, and then small dog barks quietly. Now, Ruby also has this concept called duck typing, that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. So there's less emphasis on exactly what class it is. It's more important what methods the object can respond to. So we'll see an example of that. And one of the advantages of this is that there's less code to write. For example, there's no need for method overloading as you would do in Java. Now, for method overloading, I guess usually you would have one of the two instances where you would have to do method overloading. Number one is if you have the same number of method parameters, but different types of parameters. So as we're going to see, duck typing takes care of this one. Another reason you would sometimes overload a method is if it takes a different number of parameters, and as we're going to see, Splat takes care of that. So let's see an example of duck typing. Let's say you have a class called range printer. It's basically a class whose responsibility is to print the range between two things. So it has one method called one up to another, and it prints those. It prints the range between the one and the other. Now, but what class is one and the other? Well, it turns out you don't really care. As long as one supports a method called up_to, that you have one up to another, it doesn't matter what the actual class of one and another is. So let's see an example. Let's say you have A1 and A2, which are integers. One is 5 and one is 7. So then one up to another, A1 and A2 will print out 5, 6, and 7, because the integer class of 1 supports a method up_to that passes in another and takes in a block, and it prints 1 up until the other. But it turns out that a string, so let's say B1 is a string A8 and B2 is a string B3, string also supports a method up_to. So you could do one up to another on the strings B1 and B2, which will print out A8, A9, and up to B3. So the idea is that the idea of duck typing is that as long as the objects that you're passing in support the methods that you're calling, it doesn't really matter what class those objects belong to. Now, I also mentioned this idea of Splat. So Splat is basically an asterisk. So you prefix a parameter of an asterisk, and then whatever parameters you're passing to a method get stuffed into an array. And as we're going to see, it works the other way as well. If a method is expecting n arguments, let's say 5 or 6 arguments, and you have an array with that many elements, you could just pass the array and use that with Splat syntax. So let's say you have a class called person, and it has a method add addresses. And this addresses here is a splat. So you have a splat. Almost think of it as something that gets splattered into many pieces, right? So you have add addresses that takes an addresses parameter, which is a splat. So it ends up being it's just an array that you could assign to an addresses array. And let's say the address class is just, you pass in an address, and the toString of that is just an address. And as we saw, the toString method, all it does is it just prints the name lives at the addresses join, which will basically print out multiple addresses with an end in between. So how would you use that? So you would import or load in the person class. You would load in the address class, and let's say you instantiate address 1 and address 2 just by passing in the string of where they live. And then you have a person class, which is just person class. And then you could say add addresses. Now in this case, you just pass in one address, so it ends up being an array with one address in it. But you could also have two addresses that you're passing in. Add addresses, address 1 and address 2, and internally it becomes an array because you're using the splat syntax. Now the splat also works the other way around. So if you have a method that takes in three parameters, 1, 2, and 3, and then you have an array that happens to have three parameters, 1, 2, and 3, and then you call this method, which supposedly takes three parameters, 1, 2, and 3, as we saw above, but you're passing in one parameter, which is an array, but you splat that array into three parameters, that's fine as well.